Hitchcock does exactly the same thing, these incredibly simple motifs that tie into the bigger picture of the narrative. Right? Okay, let's keep going. Subject. The birth of the Virgin Mary. That larvae-like looking thing that you see right there is the Virgin. She's been swaddled quite tightly there, right? She's being handed to mom. Remember the bedspread? There it is again, right? And then here's the Virgin Mary again. It's very common in medieval painting to have the same figure appear more than once in the same scene. Right? It's the only way they knew how to tell the story. And can anyone tell what this woman is doing down there? She's cleaning out the nostrils of the newborn. I don't know if you know this or not, but that's usually one of the first things the doctors do. Newborn infants, of course, are born with their nasal passages full of phlegm and what have you, and because they can't breathe out of their mouths, they immediately have to clear out those nasal passages. Why is he showing that? Well, because that's part of childbirth, right? It's not the Virgin Mary who kind of walked out of her mother's womb, as most of us would probably imagine, right? This is just a regular sort of human birth. I didn't mention this earlier, but Giotto, aside from being celebrated as one of the greatest painters of all time, was also allegedly a very virile man, the proud father of 13 children. Okay, presumably he saw one or two of those childbirths himself, so he knows of the very mundane aspects of childbirth, which he includes in this particular scene. By the way, this leads to one of the most famous anecdotes of the 14th century. We're pretty sure that when Giotto was working on these frescoes, his good friend, Dante, actually stopped off in Padua, pay him a visit, watch him working on the scenes. And the exchange that allegedly occurred between the two of them, I think, is quite humorous. The story goes that while Giotto was up there working on the frescoes, Dante was down below admiring his work, and he made the following comment or the following question to Giotto. He says, Giotto, why is it that your painted figures are all so beautiful, but your children are all so ugly? To which Giotto responded, well, I paint my figures by day, and I make my children by night, right? Now, whether or not this exchange actually occurred, I think is kind of beside the point. What's more important is that you don't expect Dante and Giotto, two of the greatest artists in the entire history of our species, to talk that way, right? I mean, me and my buddy sitting over a couple of beers on Friday night, okay, that's fine. But I think the anecdote suggests that their personalities were very down to earth, were very almost vulgar, as I mentioned, so therefore their artwork was as well. Okay? And while that's all happening on the inside of the scene, look over this way. Here's a woman who's collected all the dirty towels that were used during the actual childbirth, handing them to a female figure. In fact, earlier today, one of your classmates pointed out that she looks very much like the spinster eavesdropping lady that we saw earlier. I've never made the connection, but I think there's something to it. But her body language tells us that she's actually communicating with this woman. The way her head drops down, the way her mouth is open, and what question do you think that she is posing to the woman in red inside the room? Yeah, it's the first question you ask when any child is born, boy or girl. Right? So this isn't the Virgin Mary's birth, it's just any regular childbirth that we're looking at. Pre-restoration slide, okay? The subject is what we call the presentation of the Virgin Mary. Okay? When she's around 10, she has this kind of coming out party, if you will, and she is presented to the priests at the temple. Most other artists who depict this scene show the Virgin Mary walking up the 10 stairs of the temple as if she were a high-paid catwalk model, right? She just kind of struts her stuff. She's got, the 14-inch stilettos on and what have you. She's the Virgin Mary. She's got it all under control. Giotto instead shows a very, very nurturing mommy figure here in St. Anne, who's kind of nudging her daughter up the stairs. Virgin Mary or not Virgin Mary, these are some scary-looking guys up there waiting for her. And so you get a very human depiction of the event as opposed to, instead, a divine, if you will. Right? Okay, and so begins my absolute favorite sequence of paintings in the entire history of art. The legend concerning the Virgin Mary tells us that she grew up to be so virtuous and beautiful that every young man in Nazareth wanted her hand in marriage. Okay, when I say grow up, I mean 10, 11 years old, right? Which is rather common at the time. And so they couldn't figure out which one of these men was actually worthy of the hand of the Virgin. Okay? So what they decided to do was to have God choose the appropriate husband for the Virgin Mary. And an announcement was made by the priest of the temple that any man interested in the hand of the Virgin Mary should present himself at the temple with a rod, with a stick. These rods would be collected. They would be blessed by the priest. Whichever of the rods distinguished itself from all the others, the bearer of the rod would win the hand of the Virgin Mary. Okay? So what is the subject of the first scene that I'm showing you here? No? So we have any budding art historians in the group? The presentation of the rods. Okay? So here are all these young men. We know they're young because they have full heads of brown hair. And the story goes that in Nazareth there was another man significantly older than the Virgin and older than the other men participating in the competition. And he was kind of embarrassed to participate because of the age difference. Okay? And his name was Joseph, right? Particularly fond of the Virgin Mary, but not quite sure if he should participate or not in the competition. Here is Joseph, identifiable because of his halo. And we can also see that he's much older than everyone else because of the white hair that he has. Okay? So the presentation of the rods. The scene that follows. What's going on here? Anyone? What are they doing? They're watching. We call this the watching of the rods. The rods have all been collected. They've been assembled into a pile. Here are the priests. They've already blessed them. So we're all now anxiously waiting for something to happen. Okay? The watching of the rods. So what's actually happening in this scene? Nothing, exactly. And why would Giotto paint an entire scene dedicated to nothing? Thank you very much. Suspense. In other words, we can go from A to B, right? I can show you the presentation. I can show you how it ends. And you'll all yawn and keep following my lecture and whatnot. Or I can show you the presentation and then this dramatic moment when we're all waiting to see what's going to happen. The music that I imagine accompanying this particular scene, Jeopardy music, right? As we're waiting for Final Jeopardy sort of thing. They're all watching the rods. And we know from the story that Joseph, in the end, decided not to participate in the competition. We're told that he instead remained at the back of the temple, and I'm quoting here, with his rod in hand, when it miraculously burst forth into bloom. A lily popped out of Joseph's rod, and a dove descended from the sky and landed on it, and that, of course, distinguished him to be the husband of the Virgin Mary. So here's Joseph putting his wedding ring on the hand of the Virgin Mary. Here his magic rod. You can clearly see the lily there and the dove on top. I love the reaction of everyone else. This guy is crying foul. He wants to inspect the rod, right? Maybe it's been corked or something like that. This guy is breaking his rod over his leg. And you can interpret that gesture however you want, right? And did they pick up on the nuance of this particular? Of course they did, everyone. It's as obvious then as it is now. In fact, I think one of the most humorous things in the entire history of art, that same artist who was denied permission to show the saints kissing that I mentioned before, also painted this scene in that Florentine church of Santa Croce. And one of the losers in the competition, in his version, is walking out of the scene with nothing less than a tree on his shoulder. So all the other men brought saplings and rods. This man actually showed up with a small tree on his shoulder, and he, of course, lost the competition. The moral of the story being, it's not the size of the rod that makes the difference, right? It's the magical quality instead, as, of course, evidenced by this particular scene. And I find it absolutely intriguing. I mean, imagine these two artists in the 14th century, cracking cold beers on Friday night and looking up at the scene saying, I can't believe you actually painted that sort of thing, right? As humorous then as it is today, 700 years later. All right, let's keep moving here. We finish up the cycle of the Virgin Mary up here, top left-hand side. So physically now, we need to move from one side of the chapel all the way down to the other side. And the way Giotto does it is absolutely fluid in its arrangement. We actually move across the arch through a subject, then down to this, and then we begin reading the second tier of images. Let's go through it scene by scene. Here is the angel Gabriel, okay, on one side of the arch. Here is God the Father above the arch. Here is the Virgin Mary on the other side. So angel Gabriel facing the Virgin Mary, we have an Annunciation, right? So this begins technically the life of Jesus Christ, because the moment Virgin Mary found out that she was going to have a child is technically the moment of Christ's conception. Below the Virgin, the scene, is the visitation, where Elizabeth visits her cousin, the Virgin Mary. So now this sets into motion the actual life of Jesus Christ. I'm going to move through some of these rather quickly, okay, because we just don't have time to go through all of them in depth. I'll point out what I think are the more entertaining aspects of them. What is the subject here? Yeah, or what we call the Nativity, right, the birth of Jesus Christ. One comment I have to make is the accuracy with which Giotto depicts the scene. The Virgin Mary's done all the work here, right? She's just given birth, and she's still up, right? You get poor Joseph down here, right? Completely conked out after a long day of events. And again, I've had the pleasure of this type of experience, and it's true. The men endure all the stress. We're the ones waiting, right? The women, of course, actually give birth, and so they're the ones, I think, who are a bit more stress-free. Poor Joseph just overwhelmed by the stressful day, conking out there at the bottom of the scene. What is the subject here? Brava. The adoration of the Magi, right, or the three kings who bring their gifts to Jesus Christ. The only thing I think worth mentioning here is the rather interesting hybrid animal that Giotto has, a blue-eyed llama-like camel that you see coming into the scene. Maybe he never saw a camel in his life. Okay, one of the most celebrated of the scenes in the Arena Chapel is this one. Okay, does anyone recognize the subject matter here? Yeah, we call it the flight into Egypt. Okay, story goes that when King Herod found out that a king was allegedly born in his territory, he feared for his own power. He then ordered the massacre of all male children under the age of 2. Luckily, the Holy Family got out of Dodge right in time, right? And they fled into Egypt, hence the flight into Egypt. And the reason we celebrate this image is because it expresses successfully something that is almost non-existent in 14th century painting, and that is it? Travel is more specific. The more general would be movement, right? Most artists in the early 1300s, if showing someone in movement, would still have them represented frontally and perhaps just turn their feet to a parallel position to the plane, right? So the idea is I'm looking this way but moving that way. Giotto instead, I think, captures movement quite extraordinarily in this particular scene. This is perhaps the most happy donkey that you will see in the history of Western art, right? That big smile on its face, and considering its burden, I think it's somewhat justified. I absolutely adore the side saddle position of the Virgin Mary, making it a very elegant scene as well. A rather generous figure of Christ here, right? A very chubby child in her arms. There's Joseph leading the way. This is not just the image, by the way, that kind of cuts Joseph off. He actually disappears behind the border of the actual scene. And so too does the figure on this side disappear behind the border. So it's almost as if the Holy Family is passing through a clearing in the forest or something like that. And they, of course, would then gradually disappear once they continued on. The landscape complements, of course, this notion of movement with this fin-like shape that you see, moving us in that direction. If you're still not getting it, how about the traffic cop angel up there? Keep it moving, let's go. Right? Nothing to see here, let's keep it moving on, right? It's like a Laker game here, right? Downtown sort of thing. And again, looking at it in the context of everything else, it seems quite normal for Giotto, but in the context of the early 14th century is absolutely unique. Okay. Subject. Okay, this is the Massacre of the Innocents. As graphic and as bloody a scene as it may seem to you, and if you haven't noticed yet, the pile of infant cadavers down here with their clearly visible stab wounds, right? There's a disembodied head rolling around down there as well. Believe it or not, this is one of the more subdued versions. I could show you a whole series of 14th century paintings of this subject, which are just nauseating. I mean, body parts all over the place, blood and what have you. Giotto instead decides to emphasize the emotional suffering of the moms who have lost their children. In fact, you don't really see any murder going on. This one's kind of covered by this guy's body. This guy is about to kill the child. So you don't actually see any of the slaughter taking place before their eyes. What you do see, of course, is the expressions on the faces of the moms there. which is nothing less than almost banshee-ish, right? And its depiction as they look up, cringing, of course, in horror at the loss of their